Okay, what I'd like to go over is how I set up Max and Arnold when I'm doing surfacing so that I can have an active shade opens as I am doing my manipulation of the shader and the materials that I can see it what it's going to look like. So I've got this kind of a little widget here that I'm texturing. So how I set up Max is I'm going to initially go to the material editor. Now I have some shaders. This is a complex shader I've been working on that's already sitting in here. Okay, and this is what's applied to the object. Now one of the things I do is under rendering, I go to my render setup. And I make sure I have my active shade on and I have Arnold on. Okay. Then one of the first things I do is I come to the Common tab and I come all the way down here to the bottom to assign renderer. By default, once you turn whatever render on up here, it loads that renderer down here. Okay. So it loads it for production and active shade, which is what I want, but it loads it Arnold also into material editor, and Arnold doesn't work very well on material editor. So I change this setting. So I unlock this, I click here, and I want to change it to the ART renderer. Okay. Now a lot of times by default it'll like put the scan line in here. Okay. What we want is the ART renderer. That is Max's version of a physically accurate rendering engine, so it's very close to Arnold. Then I'll save that as my default, and then I will come in here and it will hopefully update. Now you can force it to update the thumbnails to show you by going to this little button right here and go down to additional options and go clear preview thumbnail cache. Click yes, then it's going to dump the cache to everything and then reload them. Okay, and it'll create new icons for everything. So what happens a lot of times if we're using a physical shader in here and we've got Arnold displaying it, it'll turn black on us. So you might have experienced that. Okay, some other things that I set up while I'm in here. I will normally have my preview window square. So I'm doing 800 pixels by 800 pixels. Okay, while I'm texturing on my widget. And now you need to make sure that you understand one of the things that's kind of weird is I can have Arnold in here, but when we switch to an active mode, a lot of times it'll switch to scan line here when you first do it. So you'll have to make sure you switch this to Arnold. Okay, on the Arnold renderer itself, okay, there's a system tab right here. Now by default, when you come in here, this is what it will look like on threads. It'll say auto detect threads and 3D Max will be turned off. So that kind of throws people off a lot of times because when they go over and start looking at their maps, they won't have many maps loaded. Okay, that's OSL. Let's start. It'll be like this. Your 3ds Max maps and you're like, okay, where are all these maps? Okay, well, it's because by default Arnold is turned those off, so you have to go right here, this is under your system tab under Arnold, and turn this on. As soon as you turn that on, then it'll load all your Max maps in here. Okay, now the other thing I do is this auto detect thread. One of the things that's happening is Arnold's a hog. It likes to use all of your threads of your cores on your CPU. So the way it works here is if I turn this off, okay, and then I want to set this, it'll be at 0. We want to set it at -1. That's telling Arnold that it can use all of the processors on the computer except one. That leaves me one open. In that case, if I want to go to a browser, look for some textures, or I want to go into Photoshop, this leaves me a processor open. Also, I found that the escape button, what if I'm starting to render and I hit the escape button, it doesn't work very well if you use all of your CPUs, okay? Where if you leave one open, as soon as I hit the escape button, then it'll stop rendering, okay? So, Common tab here, go down here, assign these renderers, and then on your System tab here, okay? Another thing that I will do is Arnold by default, if I go down here to my background, it'll say scene environment right here. And a lot of times I'll change this to a custom color. Now I'm going to leave it scene environment for right now, but then I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes and show you what I'm going to do there. Okay, so we can close that. And so now I go up here and the bottom one is the active shade. So you'll see here that it's starting to render. Okay. Now the way it renders, it's a progressive render, which allows you to speed up your workflow because you only need a part of it and then you're ready to move on to something else. If you'll look, you'll see a small little green line over here on the right hand side. That's the rendering process. That's kind of like your process of how much render is done. When that green line gets all the way to the bottom, then it's finished. But you'll see that if I come in here and I start zooming in on this, that it updates. Okay. Now I can't move around in the rendering window, but I can move around here. So if there's an area that I really want to look at, then I can move around to it and then it's going to focus on that and it's just constantly rendering all the time. Okay. So we'll go back to here. Now, a lot of times when I'm rendering, I want some light in the scene so that it's not just flat lighting, which is what we have here. This is the default lighting, just flat lighting. And I also want something to reflect into my object. So as I'm setting reflectance values, that I have something to reflect into this. So what I'll do is bring in an HDRI map. So I have one right here. So I have HDRI map right here. Now, see how it's not updating this? That's because the rendering is eating so much process. So if I click that off, then it'll update in here. So sometimes if you're worried about that, you got to stop that renderer. So this is an HDRI file that I'm using. It's an interior. And so that has lighting information in it. So when I go to my render, my exposure control, when I have Arnold on, I want this physical camera exposure control on. So I want to make sure I have that on. Right here, this is an exposure control, and this is exposure control on a per camera basis. This is my global one. So I don't want this one on for me personally. I want to be able to select and adjust my exposure on a global overall. So it doesn't matter if I'm camera or what I'm in, it'll set it. This is on a per camera basis. So when you have this on, then you set your exposure value on a camera, and I don't want to do that for right now. Okay, so here is my environment. So what I want to do is to come up here and drop this in there. Now, one of the things I want you to notice that when you bring a bitmap in, it defaults to being a texture. So right here, this says texture. Now, they've got it pretty much updated in Max now that when I put it into an environment slot, this switches to environment. Okay. So if I go over here and say, okay, now I want to put this in here. Now the question is, do I want it to be a copy or an instance? The answer is going to invariably almost always be instance, because that means that when I make adjustments to this, it'll make adjustments back to that. Okay. So when I put that in, you'll see that now that jumps into my viewport here. Okay. It's also in my viewport here now. And you'll see that now this switched from texture to environment, and it should be spherical. Now, if you I'm running on Max 2021. Now, if you're on a older version of Max, this may not automatically change. So you want to just double check, and you always change that. It needs to be on environments, not textures. If I change it to texture, it's not wrapping around us. So I want that environment, and a lot of times this environment will be on screen, like it's projecting right in front of us. We want it spherical as it's wrapping around us. Okay. Now that's doing two things. It's putting that around us. It's using the lighting from it. Can you see how it's got lighting on the top of it now? We're getting shadow and stuff in it. So it's got lighting information into it, as well as now it's got something that's going to reflect into our object. So when I'm setting how much reflection, whether that's a painted surface or a metal surface. Matter of fact, we could play with that if you want to do that. Let's bring out a physical material, and we'll just apply that to our object. You'll see it'll update there. And then if I go over here and pick a preset, say something like, oh, silver. Okay, you'll see, oh my gosh, it's really reflective. Okay. What about satin silver? Ooh, it's broken up a little bit. Maybe I can pick copper. Okay. I use copper a lot. I don't want copper, but I like the reflectance value of it. And so then I'll come in here and start changing it to what I want. And maybe a little bit more in the blue. And it's going to get me more of a steel kind of a look. Now I'm going to change from simple to advanced mode here, and then I can set how much reflective it is, so I can pull down some of that reflection on it so it's not as completely reflective. And then I could turn up the roughness, so it's going to break that up a little bit, and I can kind of control my material. So this is a good way, having this active shade open, and as you're messing with your materials to get it. Now, it'll be a little grainy in here because we're keeping the rendering quality down while we're working. Okay, then later we could kick it up if I wanted to kick a higher quality render out. Okay, so this is the shader that I'm working on, so let's assign that. That's just the this particular paint material that's on there. There's a bump in there. You can see it's giving us a little bump on that. This is a kind of a rust kind of material with some grunge that I'm putting on there, and then I'm having those put together and blended together, and it's going to give me some grunge down in our crevices, and that's because I'm using a curvature map, which is reading the curvature of what's going on here. So it's nice because it does, you know, a progressive render, and then I can sit there and manipulate it as I go. Okay. Now, sometimes, and I have a tendency to be this way myself, I don't want to really see that back there. If I go to my rendering and I go back to my render setup, and I come down to on Arnold tab, go to this scene environment right here, I can change this to a custom color, and then it's going to load color in the background. So I still have the lighting from that image, and I still get the reflection, but I don't have the color. Okay, now I normally don't want black in there. Okay, so I'll come down a little bit, and this is very sensitive. So usually like 2 or 3 is all I'm wanting to do, just so it's not black back there. And something like that works pretty good. So that's kind of the way I like to work. Now, another thing you can do, and just to kind of show you this, let's go back to the scene environment in there. if I come to my material editor and I zoom in, I'm going to this map, the U offset rotates the map. So as I am changing this, as a matter of fact, let's turn this off for a second and we'll look in our viewport. As I rotate this, it's rotating that map back there. Okay. Now, the number 1 is 360 degrees of rotation. So 1 and 0 are the same thing. 2 would be the same thing. 3 would be the same thing. Those are revolutions. Okay. It's a small amount of change is all it takes. Now, that's going to affect your lighting. Okay, so let's go back. And you'll see that as I change this, my lighting's changing because the light's coming from the image. And so when you first come in here, it's set at a certain space, a certain direction. But what you might want to do is to come in here and actually mess with this a little bit, so you can get the lighting that you think works better for you and your texturing purposes according to what you're trying to do. Maybe I want some front lighting like that. Okay, and then I'm going to go back in like we talked about, and I'm going to turn off that reflection in the background. I like it with a gray shader, so we'll just go back. Oops. Not that one. Scene environment, change it to color, and then I've got a gray back here. Then I can close that. And so now as I'm working, I can decide maybe I want to change, let's see, maybe what we're doing is getting a little bit closer. Maybe in here. And then I decide I want to change the color. Okay, so I can come in here and I can start, changing the color of whatever this is. Maybe I don't want it quite as saturated, but I want more of a blue. So it's going to update. I always have my safe frame on. That's Shift F. Otherwise, you don't know exactly how you're framing it in. You can see the edge of your gate. And that's kind of how I approach when I'm trying to surface something. I want to be able to see it in real time with lighting as I work on it on my shaders. Okay? Hopefully that'll help you guys. All right, we're going to pause this until this renders out, and then we'll see what it ended up looking like. Okay, so now you can see the green line has gone all the way down, so it's finished rendering. You'll see it's still grainy because I'm not turning up the render quality, but now I can see pretty much what my little blisters that I've created on here with a procedural texture, so I'm procedural texturing here. Now, one little peculiar thing on Arnold is normally there's a copy button up here. So if you're in Max's render, there's a copy button up here. Okay. So what you can do is clone this. So if I just click to clone it, now there's a copy button in here. Okay. Because a lot of times what I do is I want to take it into Photoshop. So I'll just click this and copy it and then paste it into Photoshop. So I'm not having to save the render, open the render. I just want to copy, paste, copy, paste, copy, paste, and then I'm pasting those on top, and then I can see how well my changes are taking effect. Okay. Hopefully that helps you out. All right. Thank you very much.